in our discussions a few minutes ago, you were saying that there was a couple of things that you want to mention about Jersey.
Yeah.
But we thought maybe we could start by just if you tell us about your mom and dad and your family, what family life was like for you when you were young.
When?
Just when you were young, just in your earliest years, how you remember your mom and dad.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Um, okay, 3, 2, 1.
No, yeah, carry on.
My mom and dad, Tom and Nellie Hodgkin, they met in Birmingham. They met on the canal, which is the bottom of Yardley Wood Road. And eventually they got married on, I believe it was August the 6th, 1929. Well, Dad was a panel beat welder, and he was a very clever man. He was what, in the true meaning of the word, journeyman. He was a man that would journey to a job, do the job, and then leave it. And he did all the panels, like for Rolls Royces and railway carriages and all sorts of things like that. In 1935, they came to Jersey, and we lived in above Miller's. It was not so very nice there. I can remember that, playing there. I think I had measles there as a kid, and for some reason I remember that. And there was a lighthouse in the gutter of the house, which was a copy of the Demodé Park lighthouse on that house, on that flat. We then moved to Victoria Park Terrace, number 7, and that's where we were there for the start of the war. Mom and Dad were a very ordinary couple. They didn't have many rows or anything like that. They were just very, very steady-going people. My mom used to be more of the driving force with my dad. My dad was the craftsman and my mom was the sort of the businesswoman. They had the workshop, which was in Bago Road, and there's a photograph which has come up on the computer under Ricky Lacane, where the Germans are marching, and you can actually see a picture of the workshop that I spent a lot of my time in those days, early days. Of course, they were here for the occupation, and that was a very dramatic period of our lives, really. In fact, it was, I suppose, not so much for me, but for my parents, it must have been blooming awful, going through all that period. Yeah.
I was just wondering, your early life with your family, do you remember things that you did as a family? What sort of things did you do as a family?
Well,
I mean, you've talked about the workshop and you've talked about the war, but what are your memories of family life? What was family life like?
Well, it was very ordinary, very, very ordinary. My mom and dad, they were very easygoing, and I can't remember anything very, very unusual about.
Did you have family friends, and did you go on picnics? What sort of things did you do?
Well, you couldn't really during the war. You could. What we did, we used to go on the beach a lot, and we used to go to the swimming pool a lot. That most of my young life was spent at the Jersey Swimming Club, and before the war, HMS Sheffield came to Jersey with all the sailors on board. I can remember that quite clearly, because my sister, who would have been only about 4 or 5 at the time, and the sailors were all thrown her into the water because she swam like a she really was a first-class swimmer, as young as she was, as 4 years old. And yes, she was quite remarkable as a swimmer. In fact, we spent so much time at the pool. Our main clothes were costumes, nothing else. And I've got a picture somewhere of Shirley with a towel and a cossie inside the towel. And she couldn't have been only 5 years old, and she was walking back to Victoria Park Terrace. Oh, that's when you think of all those days.
Were you quite a social young man? Were you? Did
No,
you have
no,
lots of
I was
friends, or?
not really social. Um, I had friends, I suppose. The kids in the neighbourhood, we all played together. When we lived in Merino Avenue, we there were cliques of boys there. And when I went to St Clement's School, we used to walk backwards and forwards. The school was about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away. And it was quite normal for kids to walk backwards and forwards to school in those days. There wasn't an awful lot of traffic, see, so it was quite safe. Um, the Then we moved to Three the Deans. Now that was a different crowd of kids that I used to play with. There was Peter Louis, Billy Burt, and all those. And John Fall used to have the garage along there, and I used to watch them working on cars and all that. I was always very interested in motor cars, the engines and that. And now they went together. It was just one of my fads as a kiddie. And my favourite book was Power and Speed at that time, which I'd got for Christmas. And it was really, I've still got a copy now. And it was really quite wonderful to see how things went together and that. Shirley and I got on very well, really, as kids. During the war period, we were very short of food, as you will appreciate. But Dad made a stove, which was a square one. Well, it was really about 18 inches long by 9 inches wide, and say a foot deep. And he made two square saucepans that fitted in there exactly, so the fire, none of the fire was lost or the heat was lost. It went straight into the bottom of these aluminium saucepans. Dad was a very, very clever craftsman when it came to welding aluminium. Very difficult metal to weld in those days, but he was brilliant at it. And he used to just cut strips of metal from the piece of metal he was going to weld, to just strips about 3 or 4 millimeters in width, and he would weld so fast because aluminium just falls away as you heat the metal. But he was brilliant with his welding and his craft in coach building and all that sort of thing. He really was. Well, I'm very, very proud of some of his work. I mean, he did a lot of coaches, because Jersey is a place where tourists were a very big thing. So all the buses and coaches were, he made new panels, and they were all domes in those days, not square like you see modern coaches and buses today.
While you're on the topic of your dad, you mentioned, while you're on the topic of your dad, you mentioned that he came out to Zimbabwe and you swapped factories for a while and he trained your staff, and how you saw his skills years later. But if you could go back and just explain what he actually did. So you set up your company and he had his in Jersey, then you swapped, is that right?
Well, when we went out to Zimbabwe, my mum and dad came out to Zimbabwe for our wedding, and then they came back. They took the boat that was going to go around Africa, but they stopped in Cape Town. They caught the boat again when it was at Myra and to go back. Then my dad went through a very, very bad patch in Jersey Motor Panels. When a stadium works, he took on a particular individual who belonged to a certain club that my father belonged to also. And this particular person misused his advantages over my dad. My dad was a person that took things very much to heart and was very correct in what he did. And so Mom wanted to get him out of Jersey Motor Panels, and they came to over to Bulawayo, and Margaret and I came to Jersey. Well, this chap, when I had arrived in Jersey, he was coming in at 2:30, and he was supposed to start work at 2 o'clock. And I said to him, "What time do you think this is? You're paid from 2 o'clock, and you're just coming in now." He says, "If you don't like it, I'll leave." And I virtually fired him on the spot. And this particular individual. Now, when my mom and dad, and I told my mom and dad about what had happened, all my mom said was, "Thank God." That's all she said, that I'd got rid of that particular individual. And that was a rather nasty part of my life, actually, because I did a radiator for a Jaguar. I can remember this very clearly. And this particular club that my dad belonged to, fellow members of it was Cyril and Ted LeGros. And they had a brand new Jaguar where the radiator was giving trouble. So I took the tanks off this Jaguar, and it was completely rotten inside the radiator, the top of the radiator. It was a film type radiator. And I told Mr. LeGros that the radiator was scrap. And he said, "That's a brand new car. How can the radiator be scrap?" Well, I managed to get the thing that it didn't leak. But when my dad came back, he got that radiator back in, and he stripped it and looked at it, and he said, "Yes, it is scrap," and confirmed what I did. But it was one of those bad periods in my life where I was having to take responsibility for the jobs that I was doing and that. But my skills were not as good as my dad's, never were. I was never a good panel beater as such. I couldn't wheel a panel. For a wheeling machine is 2 rollers where you shape metal, and I was never skilled at that. I could never get the right approach to that form of skills. But while I was at Jersey Motor Panels in about 1946, I bought a Mercedes ex-Army staff car. It was a Mercedes 170V. Well, I stripped all that old armoured car sort of body on it. It's the same vehicle as Rommel. If you see Rommel driving in one, it's the same type of car as he was in when he got killed. And but I built on that chassis, I built a sports car. But it was really a silly thing because it was a side valve engine. It wasn't really fast, but I took it on the beach and raced it. But the wheels were on the rear were de Dion suspension, and the wheels were at angles of V's. So I had to get the springs done by Salters, reset, so that the wheels were flat on the ground. It was because there wasn't enough weight in the car. Then I bought an Allard. I sold my Mercedes. Oh, I forget what I did with it then. But I bought a crashed Allard, which had crashed on St Albans Hill. Now that had got a V8 engine in it, and that was a real sports car, really, really good type of sports car. If only I had it today, it would be worth £250,000. Pounds if only I had it today. But that car was completely smashed up in the front, and I rebuilt that, and I think I sold that in exchange for an MG, and Margaret liked the MG because her initials were Margaret Lagobin, and so I got two MGs, as you might say, and at that time. But
when you're working on these cars, were you doing the actual panel beating and
everything
all the
I
mechanics?
kept mostly things flat.
So
Yeah.
were you able to work on an engine and get better performance out of it? Or did you have other mechanics helping you?
No, I didn't. Look, as far as the engine was concerned, it went very well, and I'm a great believer in don't touch something that works, and but it was only a side valve engine, and there was no way it could have been improved as a racing car as such. But I did take it up Bully Bay, and I did race it on the beach.
So did you make panels and what did you actually?
I've got photographs of it, and I should send you. Have you seen photographs of it, Jeremy?
Yeah, and then just coming back onto your dad. So you're saying that he had amazing skills, and when he went out to Rhodesia, then he taught some of your staff. Can you just elaborate on
I
that?
go on to that. Yeah. Well, while Dad was in Rhodesia, he was there. When we swapped houses and homes. Mom and Dad were in the workshop, and that was in 15th Avenue, Jameson Street. Now, it was only Philemon, and in those days, it was only Philemon and Doobie, the Africans, who were the original staff of Radiator and Tinning. And he taught those boys. He loved the African people. He got on so well. As my mom said, him and Philemon, mentally they were of the same caliber, which has been a bit derogatory of my dad, but it was he got time for people, and that was really a wonderful thing. And it wasn't until many years later that we had to make a sphere for a shopping centre in Bulawayo. And Paul was watching Philemon working on the sphere. And he said to Philemon, who taught you how to do this, to make this sphere? Because Philemon was belting this piece of metal into, the sphere was about 20 to 30 inches diameter, so it was quite big, and he was beating it up out of the flat. So Philemon said, "Oh, the old boss taught me," and so Paul says to Philemon, "You mean my dad?" He says, "No, his dad." Now, I've never been so proud in my life, ever. Because I had this conversation with Paul on the Hillside Road, and my dad's hands were alive after he'd been dead 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 years, and my dad's hands were still alive. It was a thrill of a lifetime. One of the things I will never forget, even now I have tears in my eyes when I think of the skills that Dad passed on to other people. And I'm very proud of that fact. In fact, when you think of radiation tinning, the skills, welders, machinists, lathe operators, all sorts of skills went to people. And I've forgotten a lot of the people's names these days, but it is such a pity that those skills possibly were evaporated because of the times in Zimbabwe now.
So just going back to your parents, so your dad came out and he imparted skills and so on in your fledgling company. Then you also mentioned that your mom was more of a businesswoman than a.
Well, I was going to that. When my mom came out, because the only office we got was a wooden box, and my mom sat on the wooden box, and we'd only got then was simple radiator machinery, at that time, and she actually wrote notes out how to do different things so as to be able to prompt my dad on doing these things. And if she wanted, we had the 15th Avenue Jameson Street had no toilets, no facilities whatsoever. So if she wanted to go to the toilet, she had to go to the railway station. And the railways ran alongside the workshop at that time. And but I think Mom and Dad enjoyed their stay, and they'd made quite a few friends in Bulawayo. They've all passed on, as you will expect now. But it was quite surprising how many friends they did make while they were there. And they met Nina Owen and all those people. Yeah. Then they went back via Beira through the Suez Canal. I'm always so pleased that they did their trips to Africa, because otherwise their lives would have been very, very poor for the fact that they hadn't travelled very much, and they enjoyed their trips like that. Now, when Margaret and I, we did quite a few holidays back to Jersey, and we did it through a football club that was organised by a chap who happens to live in Jersey.
Can I just interrupt you there?
Through Mr. Geddes.
Can I interrupt you? Because you're now going on to other things. So just coming back to your mom, she was more of a businesswoman. So
yeah,
in Jersey Motor Panels, she used to do the books and on. And generally the finances of the house she ran, and the contracts, and
everything. Okay, I'll speak about that. My mum was really more of the business type of person. She did all the accounting and books during the war period. In fact, because during the war period, she when the Germans requisitioned the workshop and they brought things in, that she had to know what was written. Then she went and learnt German at a chap called Herr Steiner. He was a local, I think, of Austrian descent or something like that. Fortunately for him, he didn't get... he must have been an old man, that Mr. Steiner. And my mom learned a certain amount of German so that she didn't have to pay for somebody to interpret what was written down when they got an order for something to do, or she had to write out something so that the Jerrys could interpret for themselves during the invoices and that. Not that I suppose there was a certain amount, but it wasn't. She did it from home all the bookwork she did from home. She had a little typewriter. That little typewriter, it was a little tiny portable, and she bought that off a ship that was in the harbour. And that would have been about 1938 or somewhere about there. But it was one of those very, very practical typewriters, portable, inside a case.
Your
And
mom
I can
seemed to be
remember,
very, very organized. She seemed to be
well,
organized,
my mom was definitely very well organized. She
and she
she
wrote
got
well,
the
didn't
sort of
she?
she got
Because
the
I remember
typewriter.
she did a bit of a memoir. She wrote a letter to some family, and it was an exceptional letter about her
All right.
experiences
Well,
during the war.
yeah. At the end of the war, um, I- my mum wrote. Have you got a copy of that?
Carry on.
Have you got a copy
Yes,
of the
carry on.
letters?
Carry on.
Yeah. My mum wrote to the family through Aunt Doris, who was in Birmingham, and she wrote page after page after page of what happened during the occupation, and and it was very well done. She did about 30 pages, and then Aunt Doris worked for a lady, a Jewish lady, who had got a stationery business in Moseley, Birmingham. She was rather upper market lady, and she wanted to get it printed in the Birmingham newspapers or about that. But as soon as Aunt Doris said that to my mum stopped writing right away. And the reason she gave was that she had to be so careful that of the things that the people in England had gone through and what in relationship to the way we've been during the war, it was so different. Uh, Food was our main problem here, and not anything. The Germans behaved
Yeah.
themselves exemplary here during the war period. Um,
So
if
just going
anybody
back to
got
your
into
mom.
trouble, it was me. All us kids with the Germans. It wasn't so much your parents. They kept their noses clean,
So
if you know
just
what
going
I
back to
mean.
your mom. So you describe her as an organized, financially aware type of person.
Oh yeah.
Was
Well,
she a soft, caring mom? Was she? Did
no,
you feel that?
she wasn't
Could you
exactly
go back to?
soft. No,
Could you go?
my mum
Could you tell her
was.
your? Could you speak to her about personal
Oh,
things?
yeah. Um, my mum was. She was good with us kids, really. She brought us up, and we were always very well dressed as children. And even during the war, she managed to feed us well, and we used to have sugar beet syrup and that by that. It was pretty expensive, but we never made money during the war uh, um, from the firm at all. My mum was not a person that borrowed money. She was very responsible. In fact, money in Jersey at the end of the war was available at maybe 1%. Very, very low, very cheap money. Now, we could have bought the Stadium Works for £11,000, and she wouldn't. She didn't take a chance on that. That today property is worth possibly well over £1 million.
So what was her guiding light? Do you think?
Eh?
What was her guiding light? Do you think?
What was her?
What was her guiding light? What? How did she live her life?
Oh, it was a very normal life.
What I'm saying, she.
She
What I
wasn't
remember.
church going.
Yeah.
She wasn't church going,
Your
but
mom.
we all.
Your mom used to go to church every Sunday.
Well, that was more in the latter stages when she lived at Three the Deans. Then she
Right.
went to St Nicholas because it was in the same block, and
So
she had a good.
when did that change? When did she become more spiritual?
Well, I suppose that would have been in 1943, 42, 43, yeah, during the war period.
So,
Yeah.
so in other
Yeah.
words, what year did she die then? It was 1990, somewhere around there?
Oh, she died. She died about. Gee, it's a long time ago. I couldn't tell you. It must be 30 years ago. Wait, no, it's not. She came. It can only be 15 years ago. She
So it's
was born in 1906. January is funny. My mum and dad's birthday, say, and I can't tell you which one's which. My dad was, or my mom was the 21st, and the other one was the 22nd. And I've never been able to really tell you which one was which. But they're both in January, and my dad was born in 1902. So my dad would have been 118 now, and my mom would have been.
So if she was born in 1906 and she lived to 94, is that correct?
Something like that, yeah. She was a good old age, yeah. But
So,
she
so it would have
when
been in the year 2010, say.
yeah,
So
when
about
my
20
dad
years.
died,
So she must have
um,
been. So she must have been church going from 1943 through to 2010.
yeah,
Is that
yeah,
correct?
she would have been, yeah, yeah.
So because I always remember her being very. Um, she wouldn't miss a Sunday service. Is that right?
I know she wouldn't miss it. That was her. That was one of her enjoyments, yeah.
And then who was
Well,
Auntie
she brought
Alice?
us all up. You know, I was in St Luke's choir, and I joined that in about 1940. And I was in that for a long time, for at least 4 years, you know. And in the choir there, not that I was a good singer or anything like that, but it was, I suppose, like my schooling, the De La Salle College, it was really Roman Catholic, and that was a part of my upbringing. It was the basically the Catholic Church rather than the Anglican, more so. Um,
Was your dad a
because
religious
we
man?
had prayers when we started school at 9 o'clock, and at 2 o'clock we had 10 minutes of prayers every day,
Was,
twice a
was your
day.
was your dad a religious man? Did he go to
No,
church with
no,
your mom?
Dad not so much. My dad was very uh, no, not quite as. He was a straight and good chap as an individual. My dad was. He was yeah, he was a clean living individual, very clean living.
So did
And
you you got a good moral
oh, good.
sort of
Oh, absolutely.
in
Yeah,
terms
yeah,
of upbringing? You had honorable parents.
yeah. Oh, yeah. They were. You know, when I look back, there's nothing terribly exciting that happened during our lives. You know, the worst thing was when we had a notice served on us to go to Germany, and that was at 7 o'clock at night. And the constable with a German came to the house and gave us this piece of paper, and we had to report. I think it was to St Nicholas Church, and they would take us by bus to the JMT workshops where they were congregating people. But my dad got on his bike and went up to the HKP, which was the crowd that controlled all the garages, and a chap Kessler bundled my dad into the car, and we went up to College House, and they got put off that we go on the next boat. Well, there never was a next boat. Fortunately for us, we never went. But most of the people that went to Germany from here, um, they were in a way better off than us because they more or less had, for the first period that they were in Germany, the people, they were very short of food, very short of food. But once the Red Cross got to them, they weren't too badly off at all. But the kids were not allowed. Those kids in the camps. There were 2 camps actually, and the men and the women were separated there, and the children were, under a certain age. They went with their moms, but they were at Würzburg and Biberach, 2 places. And Jersey now is partnered with Würzburg. It's a sort of a partnership, and they celebrate the mere fact that they got together after the war, sort of style.
The other thing I was thinking about was, are there any family illnesses or things that are running through the family? So your dad died of a heart.
All right, I'll tell you about his health. All right, my dad had a mastoid operation. Now, in the early days, today a mastoid would be cleared up with antibiotics by all accounts. But in those days, my dad had a hole behind his ear, which he always kept cotton wool in, but he had a positive hole behind his ear. We went to Birmingham, and my dad always had an earache sort of style, and he always sat with his hand over his ear, like closing his ear and holding his elbow sort of style. And we went to Birmingham to a firm called McNair, and the firm there asked him, "What's wrong with you? Why are you doing that?" And my dad explained his problem with his mastoid, and he said, "Look, I know a chap," he says, "a surgeon who's ear, nose and throat. He says, I'll make arrangements for you to go and see this particular chap." Well, my dad went to see, the McNair actually organised the appointment for my dad. Now, that was absolutely marvellous that they did that, because the chap explained it was the doctor was a Mr. Naylor Strong, and he must be dead many years ago now, but he was brilliant. And he actually did the operation on my dad's mastoid and then put plastic surgery over the hole, so my dad didn't have that hole there. And then he was an engineer. The doctor was, he made all his own tools, because when you do surgery on the heads, you can't describe what you want to a firm. You've got to make it for yourself. You know what you want. And so Dad said couldn't pay him any money because of the National Health. It was all done on National Health. So my dad bought him some instruments for his workshop as a gift, whatever it was. I forget exactly what it was, but it was some sort of metering device of some sort. And then later on in life, my dad, he was in 1959, he passed away. Or was it 61? My dad was 59 years old. It would have been 61. And my dad was working on a VW sports sort of car. And there's a picture of him working on that car in amongst all my library. And he burst the main artery of the blood vessel in his body. They flew him to London. Mum went with him to the most famous hospital in London now. Now I've forgotten the name of the hospital. And my dad died on the table there because there was no way that in those days that they could do an operation with the main artery burst. But the first person to have successfully done the same operation was the Duke of Windsor. And he was the first one to really get that operation done. Nowadays, they seem to be able to do it very much easier. I don't know the ins and outs of that. But he died there. Now, I flew to London to be with my mom, and the particular day, the airport was really, we should have landed at about 6 o'clock in the morning, but we ended up round and around London, and then we went up to, the plane went up to Scotland, Prestwick, and refueled and came back. So I didn't get to my mom till about 1 o'clock of the day, or about 6 or 7 hours later. And I spent and came back to Jersey with her. But you know, I didn't realize my dad had died because I'd been away for so long and short, but I didn't have the feeling that I'd lost him. It's funny, it's a funny sensation. It took a year for me to know that my dad was no longer there, at least a year. And I can't explain it, but it was one of those unusual things.
Do you feel that the grief,
grief,
so you didn't really feel the grief
no,
until a year later?
Because I suppose it's because we'd been away from home for a while, and I didn't grieve as much as I should have done. And then my mom had to. The workshop was too big, so she moved. My sister was married to Ivor Lehman. Now, Ivor was a thrower at the Jersey Potteries, and Shirley worked at the Jersey Potteries. And Ivor was a lovely person, it really was. And Shirley was very, very lucky to have married Ivor. And but one of the things, we went to France, the family, you know, and I went to pick up Ivor at his digs in his boarding house in Gorey Village. And in his rush to hurry up, he got a beautiful mop of hair our Ivor had, and he picked up a tube of stuff off the wash basin and scrubbing it into his hair as a shampoo, and it was Veet, and that's a hair remover. So
the other thing that you mentioned just before we started, you wanted to talk about your early education, but maybe you could elaborate on that and just talk about your early schooling and how you've approached educating yourself over your whole life.
All right.
If you could just talk about that.
But let me just finish. But Ivor eventually, we got him back to, and we managed to catch the boat and go to France. And we all went to France. It was a day trip, I suppose. And but it was one of those things. But Ivor was a lovely person, and Shirley, they got on very well together. But unfortunately, Ivor died at about 40. With a tumour. Now, Ivor came out selling radiators for us, and he tried to open markets for us for radiator and tinning in Nigeria and in Ghana. Very unsuccessful, and I always feel that maybe that worried him more than anything else, and we may have had some responsibility for his future life. I don't know. One of those things. My education was at, first of all, St. Luke's, then at St. Clement's, and then back to St. Luke's. Then the St. Luke's School, they put into the New Era Cinema, or the Jersey Sports Stadium. And then the Germans wanted to take over the stadium. So I was supposed to, because I lived on the one side of Platwee Road, I had to go to St. Clement's, and we decided then that I should go to De La Salle College or the Beaches. But during the war, the Beaches, the teachers were all right, but because most of the teachers had been evacuated, and so the teachers were the boys in the top class took over the classes. So the education wasn't quite up to the standard it would normally have been at the Beaches. But my best education was at night school, Jersey Evening Institute. And that started, I was one of the very, very first students. Very first night I enrolled, and we were there. I was there for at least 3 or 4 years at night school, and doing national certificate courses. But of course, we had no machinery in those days for technical subjects. But I had 3 wonderful masters. Leslie Gale for mathematics, very, very good master. Neville Minty, Major Neville Minty, ex-army, and he was machine drawing or workshop technology, absolutely brilliant engineer. And then for sciences was Colonel Eden from Victoria College. Now, he was absolutely first class too. And so that was my really grounding. See, I realized when I left, after I'd left school, how ignorant I was. And that's why I had to go to night school to improve my technical knowledge, just to improve myself generally. And one of the things with Minty, that he was making miniature engines. The firm he was working for was near the Vautier's shop, and he was making miniature engines which had to work upside down in all sorts of things. In fact, it would have been like the engine for a drone. But when this was in 1947-48, so they were way ahead of their time in developing these miniature engines that had to work in all sorts of funny angles, upside down, and that so the carburetors would work. And that, in fact, it's the same as the Spitfire. The Spitfire, if it got into turned upside down, the engine would falter. And they had a simple method of getting the fuel on the Spitfire into the engine when it was upside down or in doing funny curves and that. That was, I've always been learning. One of the things about it, I've always been one for books, technical books, and I spent a lot of time, I suppose I studied and did things which was abnormal to other people. My life has been rather selfish in one way, that I did the things that I wanted to do. And I don't know, I was always ahead of myself. One of the things that we started in Bulawayo was that we ended up with a lot of scrap metal, scrap radiators, and it was so. The British Metal Corporation, who I used to sell metal to, or any of the scrap dealers, but I never got what I considered a fair price for my scrap. So I was always looking for an idea of how to liberate the materials in those scrap radiators. Well, the mines department in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia at that time, they would grind up a granite, and they'd get three pennyweights of gold out of a ton of granite, and they'd think they'd done well. Well, I'd got a radiator that was 90%, well, it was 100% metal. So I rang the mines department and I told them, you do that for 3 grams of gold. I've got physical metal. How do I liberate it? Well, I wanted them to electro-win it. They were doing that in Kwekwe, electro-winning copper cathodes. And so I wanted the mines department to see if they could do the same with a radiator, old radiator. Well, I sent a sample to the mines department, and they couldn't make it work as far as using electro-winning. It wouldn't work for some reason. So they melted the sample that I got, and they came back. They said, when we melted it, that it was 85% copper, 5% zinc, 5% tin, and 5% lead. And so there was 3 5s and 85. And that was a straight gunmetal. And when I found that out, I'd also belonged to an organization called Tin Research. And I used to get their books out from England. I belonged to various organizations. I belonged to Copper Development organization. I belonged to the Tin Research thing, which was all part of my education, I suppose. And there was a thing called continuous casting, which had been developed in England. And I saw the photographs of this because I always had all those books which came out every month or every so often period. And I saw this article on continuous casting. So I went over to England to Tin Research. But we used to always buy our solders from Kamativi. Now, Kamativi represented Fry's Metals in Zimbabwe, at least I think they did. But I used to buy tin lead solders from them. And so I'd got a good relationship with Fry's Metals, and they were doing continuous casting of bronze. So I went to their factory in south of London, and I saw what they were doing. There was just an upper floor with a crucible furnace and pouring into a crucible and withdrawal rolls. And I looked at it, it was so simple that I went back to Bulawayo and I built the first one myself. But I made a mistake in that I used ordinary helical gears, which would have been very, very dangerous if we'd had a run out, because the whole lot would have just run, the gearbox wouldn't have held up in any way. So I ended up buying Peugeot differentials to make in the gearbox. So in each gearbox, I would have 5 Peugeot differentials. Now, eventually, I'd bought every differential that was in Zimbabwe that was available at any scrap merchants or car breakers and places like that. I'd got all the differentials and I used those in the gearboxes, and that would prevent a run out, the material running through, because of the type of helical gears that are in that type of back axle. And it was very, very successful continuous casting. In fact, we used to sell worldwide. In fact, it was a joke at McKechnie's when Trevor did the first continuous casting. It was over the ladies' toilet in Bulawayo, and it was just it was really in the front office, just over the front office in those days. And but the first, I've got part of a bad piece of material, what I've still got here in Jersey, one of the original pieces that we produced, made into a lamp. We never used the lamp at all, but I've still got the material. And that was we ended up with 6 vertical continuous casting plants. And in those vertical casters, because of the diameter, we were casting up to 6 inches diameter, 6.5 inches diameter. And but then we could do hollows by putting a mandrel in the die. And the continuous casting process was just a main furnace, oil-fired, which we poured from there. That would be about a 60 kg or more, 120 kg carborundum type vessel that we used to melt the metal in. Then we pour from that into a little tiny holding furnace, which was below the bigger furnace, and we pour into there. But in that crucible, we'd mount a carbon die, and that carbon we glue into the bottom of the die. It was only 10 inches long, the water, and in that we got it into copper water jackets, which then cooled the product as it came down. And we've got special timers, Londex timers, which timed the pull for 1 second or maybe 2 seconds pull, and then 3 seconds dwell. This repeated constantly, so you got the rings around the product as you pulled. Now we were producing rod from, say, 3/4 of an inch diameter, and we'd do 4 rods at a time there, but up to 6 inch. But being as we could do hollows, the stock we had to carry was tremendous, because you got 6x5s, 5-inch hollow, 6x4s, 6x4.5, and right down to where you got a 6-inch with a 2-inch bore. Maybe we wouldn't go any lower than that.
Can I interrupt there? Yeah, that's great. That's very interesting. But just coming back, just because we're coming to the end of an hour now, so I think it's probably time to stop.
Oh yeah.
But
and the family have just arrived back.
So in terms of education, it was a continuing process through your life.
I've never looked, Jeremy. If only I'd got YouTube today, I wouldn't have made the mistakes I made years ago.